Let's talk about meditation 2, concerning the nature of the human mind, that it is better known than the body. I'll have more to say about that title later on, but let's start with what is, I would say, most obvious about the second meditation and probably most famous about the second meditation, which is Descartes' proof of his own existence, or the meditator's proof of his own existence. The I exist is going to turn out to be the first truth that we can be absolutely certain about. Let's recall that the first meditation was supposed to bring us into a state of sort of a kind of mental emptiness almost, where we had lost all of the usual prejudices, all of our usual beliefs, in order to have sort of a clear playing field in which philosophy can be done. And now the meditator says, okay, in this emptiness, what am I going to do? How am I ever going to arrive at any truth? And he says this. He says, Archimedes sought but one firm and immovable point in order to move the entire earth from one place to another. And he's referring to a famous saying by the Greek mathematician and physicist Archimedes, who said, if you give me a lever that is long enough and a firm place to stand on, I can move the entire earth. Something like that. Well, the meditator goes on, just so, great things are also to be hoped for if I succeed in finding just one thing, however slight, that is certain and unshaken. Is there anything that none of the skeptical hypotheses of the first meditation, including the evil genius, could possibly make me doubt? Is there anything that is certain and unshaken? Well, and of course he goes on to argue that, yes, there is one thing that is certain and unshaken, because if he is doubting, if he is being deceived, if he is thinking at all, it must be the case that he exists. Right? And so we come to this preliminary conclusion. Thus, after everything has been most carefully weighed, it must finally be established that this pronouncement, I am, I exist, is necessarily true every time I utter it or conceive it in my mind. And so Descartes is not saying that I exist is necessarily true. It would seem that maybe I exist is not necessarily true, because he could also not have existed, right? It's possible that there never was any Descartes. But if I'm thinking it, every time I utter it or conceive it in my mind, I am, I exist, must be true. So here is a truth that as soon as you really think about it, or rather here's a statement that as soon as you really think about it, you're going to be able to see, Descartes suggests, you're going to be able to see that it must be true. If I think about it, if I think, do I exist, then it's immediately clear by what Descartes later on might call the natural light. It's immediately clear that this is true. Yes, of course I exist. I can't doubt that. If you think it, it must be true. Now I want to say two things about the formulation here, right? The first is that what he says here is, I am, I exist. Now, Descartes famously wrote, I think, therefore I am, but that's not in the Meditations, right? That's not in how he presents it here. I do believe that phrase, for instance, exactly that phrase, is in the Discourse on Method, for instance, the earlier text. I think, therefore I am. And in fact, this entire part of Descartes' reasoning is generally known in the literature as his discussion of the cogito. And cogito is Latin for I think. So this element of I think is very famous and supposed to be very central to the discussion. So what I want to say about that is first that maybe the Meditations presentation is in a sense slightly clearer, right? I think, therefore I am, suggests a kind of reasoning, Like, oh, first I find out that I think, and then I conclude from that that I am, which, to be honest, looks kind of dubious. I mean, if I have this thought, I think, I'm kind of already presupposing that there is this I which is thinking, right? So what kind of argument do I still need? What kind of therefore do I still need to arrive at I am? That might not be the best way of presenting it, right? As a kind of explicit argument. On the other hand, and that's the second thing I want to say, there are good reasons to call this the cogito argument, or the discussion of the cogito, of the I think, because you can't just leave out the thinking. It's not the case that Descartes could have, not talked about thinking at all or doubting at all, and just said, oh, look, I exist. If somebody says I exist, it must be true. Maybe there is a sense in which if somebody says I exist, it must be true, because I'm sort of already bringing in the word somebody there. But there can be an utterance, I exist, that is not true, right? If the wind and the waters create on the sands of the beach the words I exist, it's false, because there's no I there. Now, this I, which is central here, is for Descartes, and this is really important, this I is a thinking I, right? I recognize this I grasp this I by paying attention to this activity of thinking. It is in thinking that I discover the I, and primarily this I is a thinking I. So Descartes notices himself thinking, and he realizes that this means that he exists. Or the meditator does all of this, but maybe the distinction is not so important here. So he notices that he exists, and that's his first truth, right? His first Archimedean point. And that's nice. And, that's where we can start reasoning. But it's only where we start reasoning. And now Descartes is going to ask a very important question, which is the question of, what is this I? I do not yet understand sufficiently what I am. What am I? What is this I that I am noticing here? And so maybe before we talk about the rest of the first half of the meditation, it's nice to think a little bit about this question. What is going to be Descartes' conclusion about the I here? What is this I, and what isn't this I? So maybe think about that a little bit. And then I'm going to talk about it, which I'll start doing now. So he doesn't yet sufficiently understand what he is. Well, there's a lot of stuff Descartes is going to tell us that we usually associate with the I, that has been touched, that has been disturbed by the doubts from meditation 1. Right? Usually I think that, well, I am this body, I have 2 hands, I have a nose that I can tap against, which is somehow my, running gag throughout this lecture series, and so on and so forth, right? But all of that, the very existence of this body is something that has become doubtful through what happens in the first meditation. Right, so all of that, Descartes says, all of that I'm going to bracket it. Right, let me think about that later, but for now, this I that I so clearly know exists, it can't be that I. Right, it can't be the case that it's this body, because I don't know whether the body exists. I don't know whether I have hands and so on, at least not with this kind of clarity and certainty. No, this I, which I immediately grasp, when I realize that I think, that I exist, what is it characterized by? What is it that I grasp? Well, it's not, as we said, the body. What about the soul, he says? What about being nourished or moving about? Right, and here soul is very much sort of the traditional sense of something that animates the body. right? So it's things like being nourished, moving about, the kinds of things that animals definitely also do, that Descartes here in a sort of Aristotelian tradition is going to count as belonging to the soul. Well, he doesn't know about that, right? To move about, you need a body. What about sensation? Like, I'm seeing this pencil. Well, I am only seeing this pencil if there actually is a pencil, and I don't know about that, right? That also is under the doubts of the first meditation. What about thinking? Ah, now we're at something, right? What about thinking? Here I make my discovery. Thought exists. It alone cannot be separated from me. I am. I exist. This is certain. But for how long? For as long as I am thinking. For perhaps it could also come to pass that if I were to cease all thinking, I would then utterly cease to exist. At this time, I admit nothing that is not necessarily true. I am therefore precisely nothing but a thinking thing, that is, a mind or intellect, or understanding or reason, words of whose meanings I was previously ignorant. Yet I am a true thing, and am truly existing. But what kind of thing? I have said it already. A thinking thing. And he goes on to suggest that the existence of this thinking thing, which he knows for certain, doesn't depend on anything that he doesn't know for certain. Right? He doesn't know whether he has a body, but he knows that he exists as a thinking thing. So the thinking thing can't depend on the body. That is at least a preliminary suggestion here. Of course, as you may well know if you know anything about Descartes, Descartes is going to end up defending a very strict mind-body dualism. Right? There's the mind and there's the body. They're two completely different substances which can exist completely independently of each other, right? My mind in no way needs my body, and my body in no way needs my mind. That's going to be Descartes' final conclusion. Now, he seems to be saying something like that already here, but in fact, those conclusions aren't going to follow until we are in Meditation 6. So if there's anything, and I would say there is something that is kind of confusing about the way that Descartes is discussing these issues here in Meditation 2, it's that he sometimes talks as if he has already proved very far-reaching metaphysical conclusions, right? The conclusion that I am purely and only a thinking thing, that the body is, in a sense, not really mine, that the mind and the body are independent substances that don't need each other. He kind of talks at certain points as if that's what he's proving here, but he's clearly not proving it. He's not giving us any argument for those kinds of conclusions. And then there are other sentences in this same Meditation 2 where he says, well, you know, at least that's kind of the way that I'm thinking about it now, right? But this is something we'll have to return to later. So he says something like, where is it? Well, he says something like, right, at this point I am ignoring everything that I'm not certain of, right? At this point I'm ignoring the body because I don't really know whether it exists, and so on and so forth. So officially, I would say, I mean, the right way to read the second meditation, and I'm going to be kind of normative about that, is that Descartes already suggests his final conclusions about mind-body dualism and the fact that I am really just a mind and not a body, but he's not committing himself to them right now, right? He's sort of putting them on the table and saying, well, you know, this is kind of what is suggested, but I'm not making that conclusion yet, right? We'll have to return to that later. So here's a way to maybe get that into a little sharper focus, and I'm going to use a little list from Margaret Wilson's book, Descartes. And Margaret Wilson, when she discusses the second meditation, and this entire cogito sequence, she says that we can distinguish 5 claims which become stronger and stronger all the time. And then we can wonder which ones is Descartes proving, which ones does he believe he has proved, and so on. First claim is I think. Clearly Descartes has, he's given us an argument for that, right? He has claimed that he thinks. That we can immediately see that. Maybe he hasn't given an argument for it, but he thinks it's immediately evident, immediately clear that, yeah, I think. That's something we cannot doubt. So I think. 2, I am a thinking thing. He explicitly says that, right? That's his conclusion. I am a thinking thing. Wilson and others correctly point out that Descartes leaps from I think to I am a thinking thing without any argument. And that is kind of strange, because this notion of a thing, of a substance, one could say, of the idea that there's some kind of object, some kind of, thing needed for the thinking to inhere in. Thinking can't just be a free-floating process. It must be a thing. It must be a substance. That is not something that Descartes argues for. That's something that he just presupposes. And he doesn't even see it as sort of requiring additional argument. And I would say that this is at least a first indication, and we're going to see this much more clearly in Meditation 3, for instance, a first indication that Descartes is definitely still caught up in earlier philosophy, right? He's making all kinds of assumptions, which he doesn't even really recognize as assumptions, that he has taken over from earlier thought. And this, I would say, is one of them. This idea that every action requires a substance, every process requires a substance. And therefore, if he thinks, he must be a thinking thing. So that's 2, I am a thinking thing. 3, thought is a property essential to me. And here essential means something that makes a thing what it is, right? If something is essential to me, then I can't lose it without ceasing to exist. That's also clearly what Descartes is claiming here, right? He's claiming that if he stops to think, well, that's when he might cease to exist. So maybe he's claiming it, he's at the very least very strongly suggesting it, that thought is it's not just that I think, but thinking is essential to me. If I were to stop thinking, I would stop existing. He, in a sense, doesn't really prove that here, and we may hear more about that later on in the Meditations. But now we come to 4 and 5, which are much, much stronger and really bring in this distinction between mind and body and this kind of mind-body dualism. 4, thought is the only property essential to me, right? The only thing that makes me what I am is the thinking. I don't require a body. That would be 5. I am essentially a thinking thing and not essentially material. Right? This adds the idea that the body is not the same as thought, and therefore, if I'm a thinking thing, and if I'm only a thinking thing, if that's the only part of my essence, then having a body is not essential to me. I could lose the body and still remain myself. Now, certainly those last 2 claims, thought is the only property essential to me, and I am essentially a thinking thing and not essentially material. Those 2 claims are sort of suggested by the second meditation, but definitely not defended by the second meditation. And we have to wait until Meditations 5 and 6 before Descartes will really give any arguments for that. So, if you don't just read the second meditation, right, what it explicitly claims, but also how he then walks back some of those claims and tries to be a little careful, you could say that what Descartes is really claiming here at this point in the Meditations is not so much that thought is the only property essential to me, but that thought is the only property that I know to be essential to me. Maybe there are others, but in Meditation 2 I haven't discovered them, and I haven't proven that there aren't any others, right? I don't know, I can be agnostic about that for now, but I know that thought is essential to me. In the same way, I don't know whether thought needs a corporeal body, whether it's dependent on a corporeal body or even identical with a corporeal body. I don't know that at this point in the meditations. That's what Descartes says here in his more careful sentences. And that's, I think, the way that we ought to read this meditation. All right, so here we have, I think, that's pretty minimal, right? If that's the only truth I know, it's not clear how I'm going to proceed from that towards any further insights. But in fact, already in the second meditation, the realm of my knowledge, the realm of the things that are clear and indubitable to me, is going to suddenly explode, right? From this one thing that I know, it's going to explode into a gigantic amount of things that I know. And so maybe this once again is a good point to ask yourself the question, which is, what is that explosion and how does it happen? Right? What is this explosion and how does it happen? Well, here's what happens. Descartes is going to zoom in on this idea of thinking, on this idea of the thinking thing. And he's going to point out that this thinking thing engages in all kinds of activities, right? I'm something that doubts, that understands, that affirms, denies, wills, refuses, and that also imagines and senses. Now, we just read, just a little bit earlier, that you can't really trust perception. That I don't know whether I'm seeing a pencil, because there might not be a pencil here. But now Descartes is going to point out something that is absolutely crucial to understanding his entire philosophy, and I would argue all the philosophy that comes after Descartes. He's going to point out that although I might be mistaken in the idea that I'm perceiving a pencil, nevertheless, in this same experience, there is something I cannot be mistaken about. So let me read what Descartes himself says. Yet I certainly do seem to see, hear, and feel warmth. He's talking about warmth, not about a pencil, but I certainly do seem, that's how I should emphasize this, I certainly do seem to see, hear, and feel warmth. This cannot be false. Properly speaking, this is what in me is called sensing. But this, precisely so taken, is nothing other than thinking. Thinking turns out to be pretty big. It includes sensation understood in the right way. Understood in the right way, sensation is not seeing a pencil. Because seeing a pencil is, it requires a pencil. If there's no pencil, I can't be seeing a pencil. Sensation is really this mental experience, this conscious experience of, something pencil-like, these color shapes, that kind of stuff. And of course I'm having that, right? Whether or not there is a pencil, I'm clearly having this sensation in the sense of a conscious mental state. That is part of thinking, right? When I say that I'm a thinking thing, Descartes isn't just, he isn't just talking about thinking about arguments or something like that. He seems to be indicating what we would today call the entire contents of our consciousness, right? Everything of which you're conscious, everything of which you're aware, is what Descartes is going to fit under thinking. What Descartes is essentially proposing is that the mental, the mind, our thinking, is very special in the sense that it is transparent, epistemically transparent. What do I mean by that? Well, transparent is you can see through it, right? There's nothing obscuring your view. The mind is supposed to be immediately clear to itself. If there's something in my consciousness then not only is it in my consciousness, but merely by paying attention to it, I can know for certain, without any doubt, indubitably, without any doubt, that it's in my consciousness. If I feel pain, I might be mistaken about the idea that it's my arm that is being pinched by my hand that causes this feeling of pain, but I can't be mistaken about feeling pain, right? I feel the pain. I can't be mistaken about having a webcam-like impression. There might not be a webcam, but I can't be mistaken about having this sensory impression. In the same way that I can't be mistaken about having a certain thought right now, having a certain desire right now, and so on and so forth. So for Descartes, the mind is transparent. It is obvious and clear and indubitable to itself. And that means that I haven't just found out that I think is certain and indubitable. I have found out that the entire contents of my mind, if I understand them correctly, namely as something that is only there in my mind, all of that is indubitable, clear immediately to me. This is a pretty revolutionary move in the history of philosophy. Sensation had more or less always been thought to be something that definitely has a lot to do with the body, that essentially has something to do with the body. The distinction between mind and body was not new in Descartes, but earlier thinkers used to make it in terms of the changeable and the eternal. So if you look at ancient authors and medieval authors, if they talk about a strict distinction between mind and body, they would usually say something like, well, the mind is what grasps eternal truths. The body is whatever is changing and malleable and, in time. And of course, if that's your idea, then the contents of consciousness are definitely, they belong on the side of the body. They change all the time, right? I just move my head and, I have different perceptions. There's nothing eternal about them. Descartes comes up with this new idea of the mental. The mental as that which is transparent, as that which is indubitable, which I grasp immediately, which if it's there, I necessarily know that it's there. And this is going to create an entirely new mind-body division, a new kind of epistemology, a new kind of philosophy. A philosophy that's going to be based on the idea that we look at the internal contents of our mind, at our ideas, as most of the writers are going to call them, because those are certain, and that's going to be the solid basis of our entire philosophy. So there's a lot happening here in the cogito. Less maybe than seems at first glance, in the sense that Descartes might suggest that he proves that I'm just only my mind and not my body, but he doesn't really do that. He's going to do that later on in Meditation 6. But there's a lot going on in terms of creating a new image of the mind, suggesting a new basis for certainty and philosophy, and really setting up, thinking about the mental and consciousness, essentially, I would say, as we still do today. I mean, there are lots of philosophers in the 20th, 21st century who are anti-Cartesian, right? Who try to develop alternatives to this Cartesian picture. But it's still Descartes there in the background as the enemy, as the one who came up with these ideas that were so influential that they shaped our entire thinking about these issues for centuries.